December 24th, 1945. Heidelberg, Germany. The knock came at 7 in the evening. 3 sharp raps that made Anna Weber's hands freeze over the pot of watery turnip soup. Through the frost-etched window, she could see the silhouette. An American uniform, broad shoulders, a pack slung over one arm. Her mother-in-law crossed herself. The children, Greta, 9 years old, Hans, 7, and little Klaus, barely 5, stopped their whispered game and stared at the door with eyes that had learned fear early. Anna's throat tightened. 3 years since the telegram about Friedrich, dead at Stalingrad. 18 months of occupation. 6 weeks since this American, this Private Thomas Mackenzie, from somewhere called Boston, had been billeted in their home, sleeping in what used to be Friedrich's study. They had learned to move around him like water around stone, invisible, silent, safe. And now he was knocking on their own door, inside their own house, on Christmas Eve. Her hand trembled as she reached for the handle. What she saw would shatter everything she thought she knew about enemies, about Americans, about the mathematics of hatred, and the impossible arithmetic of forgiveness. The door opened, and Private Thomas Mackenzie stood there holding a box so large it seemed to dwarf his lanky frame. Cardboard, stamped with U.S. Army insignia, corners reinforced with brown tape, heavy. He was 23 years old, tall and too thin despite the American rations, with red-rimmed eyes that betrayed the letter he'd received that morning from his wife in Boston. She'd written about their daughter's first Christmas, about hanging stockings, about the neighborhood gathering at St. Patrick's Cathedral. She'd written about how much she missed him, how the baby was learning to say "Dada" to his photograph. "Frohe Weihnachten," he said in his careful, American-accented German. "Merry Christmas." Then, seeing Anna's expression, the wariness, the calculation of whether to scream or submit, he added quickly, "Bitte. For the children, please." He set the box down just inside the doorway and stepped back, hands raised slightly, palms out. Universal language. "I mean no harm." Anna stared at the box. Her mother-in-law, Margrethe, made a small sound in her throat, something between a gasp and a prayer. The children pressed against their mother's skirt. "Open it," Thomas said. "I have to. My family is opening presents right now. In Boston. Right now it's Christmas morning there." His voice cracked. "Your children should have Christmas too." Anna knelt slowly, as if the box might explode. Her fingers found the flap, lifted it. Chocolate. American chocolate in rectangular bars wrapped in olive drab paper. At least 30 bars stacked like bricks. A ham. A whole canned ham, the kind that required an entire month's worth of ration points in America, and didn't exist at all in Germany. Sugar in a cloth sack, real white sugar, 5 full pounds of it. Coffee, ground coffee that released its aroma the moment air touched it, a smell Anna hadn't encountered in 4 years. Canned milk, canned peaches, canned beans. A small bag of hard candies in jewel colors, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, 3 toys. A wooden truck for Klaus, painted red and blue. A doll with a porcelain face for Greta. A small leather ball for Hans. Anna Weber, who had not cried when the telegram came about. Friedrich, who had not cried when they'd fled the bombing of Cologne. Who had not cried when she'd traded her mother's silver candlesticks for 6 pounds of potatoes. Anna Weber looked at this impossible bounty and shattered. She wept. Great, heaving sobs that bent her double over the box, tears falling onto the chocolate bars, her shoulders shaking. Margaret wrapped gnarled arms around her. The children stared, frightened by their mother's tears. They'd learned early that crying brought no comfort, solved no problems, only wasted energy better spent on surviving. Thomas Mackenzie stood in the doorway and watched a woman break open. and he understood that he was witnessing something vast and terrible. The moment when the machinery of hate begins to malfunction, when the clean lines between victor and vanquished start to blur, when the necessary fiction of the enemy's inhumanity can no longer be maintained. "I'm sorry," Anna said finally, her voice raw. "I'm so sorry. Please come in. Sit with us." It was an invitation that violated every rule, written and unwritten, of occupation. He accepted. To understand what happened that night in Heidelberg, you must understand what Christmas 1945 meant to Germany. The first peacetime Christmas in 6 years, yes, but peaceful the way a graveyard is peaceful. Silent the way trauma is silent. The numbers tell one kind of story. 3.6 million German military dead. At least 1 million German civilians killed in bombing raids. 15 million ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe, flooding westward with whatever they could carry. In the cities, Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, 70% of buildings destroyed or damaged beyond use. The Reich that Hitler promised would last 1,000 years had lasted 12, and it had taken Germany and half of Europe down with it into ashes. But numbers are abstractions. They don't capture what it meant to be Anna Weber on December 24, 1945. It meant that the Christmas tree in her parlor, if you could call it a tree, was a pine branch that Hans had dragged home from the forest, decorated with strips of newspaper folded into stars and painted with beet juice. It meant that dinner, before Thomas knocked on the door, was going to be turnip soup thickened with a handful of barley, the last of a Red Cross package from October. It meant that Greta's shoes had belonged to 3 different children before her, the soles reinforced with cardboard that dissolved in the rain. It meant that Klaus, at 5 years old, had never tasted chocolate, had never seen a banana, couldn't remember a time when his stomach felt full. It meant that when Anna looked at her children, she saw the slow starvation that the statistics called malnutrition, protruding ribs, thin arms, the dull hair and listless movements of bodies, consuming themselves for energy. The average German civilian was eating 1,200 calories per day, half what was needed to maintain body weight. Children under 6 were dying at twice the pre-war rate, their small bodies unable to fight off diseases that should have been survivable. Measles, pneumonia, infected cuts that turned septic because there were no antibiotics. It meant that Anna had sold her wedding ring in October to buy milk for Klaus, who'd developed a racking cough that wouldn't stop. The milk hadn't helped. The cough remained, a wet, rattling sound in his chest that kept her awake at night, terrified. This was the reality that Thomas Mackenzie walked into with his impossible box of plenty. They sat at the table together that night. Anna, Margaret, the 3 children, and Thomas. An absurd scene, a violation of everything the war had taught them about boundaries and sides and the unbridgeable distance between killers and killed, occupiers and occupied. Anna had protested weakly. "You should eat with your unit, with your friends." "I don't want to be with my unit tonight," Thomas said, and something in his voice suggested this wasn't generosity but need. He needed to be here at this table, with these people who were supposed to be his enemies. He needed it, the way a drowning man needs air. They carved the ham, a surreal act, the knife moving through pink meat marbled with fat, releasing smells that made Klaus whimper with anticipation. Anna made coffee, real coffee, the grounds dark and fragrant in the pot. She used the sugar, precious, impossible sugar, to make a kind of syrup that she drizzled over slices of the canned peaches. The children stared at their plates as if they were hallucinations. "Eat slowly," Anna warned them in German. "Your stomachs aren't used to rich food." But they couldn't eat slowly. Greta stuffed ham into her mouth with both hands, tears streaming down her face. Hans ate until he vomited into a bucket, then ate more. Klaus held a piece of chocolate between his fingers and stared at it for 5 full minutes before taking a tiny, reverent bite, his eyes closing in something like religious ecstasy. Thomas watched them and felt something twist in his chest. He'd known, abstractly, that Germans were hungry. Everyone knew that. The occupation authorities knew it, documented it, filed reports about caloric intake and food distribution. But knowing and witnessing are different countries, separated by an unbridgeable chasm. He thought about his own daughter, back in Boston, surrounded by plenty, the photographs his wife had sent, the baby in a high chair, applesauce smeared on her chubby face, laughing, the absolute security of never questioning where the next meal would come from. "My father died at Stalingrad," Greta said suddenly, in careful, school-taught English. She was looking directly at Thomas, her chin lifted in something like defiance. "The Russians killed him." Silence crashed down on the table. "I'm sorry," Thomas said quietly. And then, because it seemed necessary to say the whole truth, "My brother died in the Ardennes. Last Christmas, the Battle of the Bulge. He was 20 years old." Anna's hand stopped halfway to her mouth. "German soldiers?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." They sat with that for a moment. The terrible mathematics of it. German soldiers had killed Thomas's brother. Allied soldiers had killed Anna's husband, and now they were eating ham together on Christmas Eve, and no one knew what that meant or how to make sense of it. "The war is over," Margaret said finally, her voice cracked with age and grief. "God forgive us all." "Amen," Thomas said, and he meant it. What happened in Heidelberg that night was happening in hundreds of houses across occupied Germany. The great terrible experiment of Christmas 1945. What happens when you force enemies to share space, to see each other's children, to smell each other's cooking, to hear each other's grief? The official policy was non-fraternization, a cold word for a simple rule. Don't get close to the Germans. Don't befriend them. Don't sympathize with them. Remember what they did. Remember the concentration camps, the death marches, the 6 million Jews murdered in industrial fashion. Remember that these people, even the ones who claimed they didn't know, who claimed they were just following orders, enabled one of history's greatest evils. The rule made sense. Of course it made sense. How could you forgive the unforgivable? How could you break bread with people whose government had tried to exterminate entire races, whose army had ravaged Europe, whose ideology had made murder a matter of policy? But the rule collided with reality in strange ways. In Munich, Sergeant Joseph Richie found himself billeted with the Schneider family. Mother, grandmother, 12-year-old daughter. Herr Schneider had died in France in 1944, killed as it happened by American artillery. The family avoided Joseph for the first 2 weeks, communicating in monosyllables, treating him like a hostile occupying force. Then, on December 24th, Joseph's grandmother's recipe for pasta e fagioli got the better of him. He'd received a care package from home. Dried beans, canned tomatoes, pasta, olive oil. His grandmother in Naples had enclosed the recipe on a piece of paper, stained with what looked like tomato sauce, and Joseph's homesickness was so acute, it felt like a physical wound. He started cooking in the Schneider kitchen, using their stove and the smells. Garlic sizzling in olive oil, tomatoes reducing into sauce, beans softening in broth, drew the family like a magnet. "What is that?" the daughter, Liesel, asked, her stomach audibly growling. "Dinner," Joseph said. "There's plenty. You want some?" They ate together. Liesel had 3 bowls, her hunger finally sated for the first time in months. Frau Schneider cried quietly into her hands, while her mother patted her shoulder, and Joseph Richie, whose family had emigrated from Italy to New York before he was born, whose grandparents still spoke Italian at home, found himself thinking, these people aren't monsters, they're just people. Hungry, broken, grieving people. It didn't erase what Germany had done. Nothing could erase that. But it complicated the story in ways that made Joseph's head hurt and his certainties crumble. In Frankfurt, Corporal Daniel Goldberg experienced his own crisis of comprehension. Daniel was a Jew from Brooklyn, the son of immigrants who'd fled pogroms in Poland. He'd volunteered for the army in 1942, the day after his 18th birthday, because he'd seen the photographs from Europe, read the reports about what the Nazis were doing to Jews, and felt a moral imperative to fight. He'd been among the soldiers who liberated Dachau in April. He'd walked through the barracks, seen the skeletal bodies stacked like cordwood, smelled the sweet, sick stench of mass death. He'd watched grown men vomit and weep. He'd promised himself that he would never forgive, never forget, never extend mercy to the people who had done this or allowed it to be done. And then he was billeted with Pastor Heinrich Müller and his family in Frankfurt. The Müllers were Protestant, devout, careful. Pastor Müller had spent the war preaching sermons that walked a razor's edge, obedience to authority, because defiance meant death, but also subtle resistance, because silence meant complicity. He'd hidden 2 Jewish families in his church basement for 8 months in 1943. When the Gestapo came asking questions, he'd lied with a straight face, and the families had survived and escaped to Switzerland. One of those families was the Goldsteins, Daniel's cousins. Daniel learned this on December 23rd, when he mentioned his last name, and Pastor Mueller's face went white. "Goldstein," the pastor repeated. "From where?" "Brooklyn. But my father's family was from Lodz in Poland. We had cousins here. I don't know if they—" David and Sarah Goldstein, with 3 children. Daniel's heart stopped. Yes, that's them. Are they alive? I don't know, Pastor Mueller said quietly. But they were alive when they left here. I hid them, for 8 months, in my church. The world tilted. On Christmas Eve, Daniel Goldberg brought candied fruits to Pastor Mueller's family. Expensive, luxurious, obtained through trading cigarettes with other soldiers. He helped them decorate a tiny Christmas tree, with strips of foil from cigarette packs, folding them into stars. And when the family began singing Stille Nacht, Silent Night, Daniel found himself singing along in English, tears streaming down his face. He was crying for his cousins, who might be alive because of this German pastor. He was crying for the 6 million who weren't alive, who would never sing this song again. He was crying because the story was too complicated, because hatred was supposed to be clean and simple, and nothing about this was clean or simple. "Thank you," he said to Pastor Mueller afterward, his voice breaking. "For my family, thank you. I did what any Christian should do," the pastor said. "What any human should do. Most didn't." "No," Pastor Mueller agreed, his face etched with grief. "Most didn't. May God forgive us." The soldiers who shared these Christmas dinners carried guilt that felt bottomless. They'd been sent to Germany expecting to find monsters, and they'd found human beings. Exhausted, hungry, traumatized human beings who'd been caught in the machinery of history and ground down by it. This didn't exonerate Germany. Nothing could exonerate what had been done. The systematic murder of millions, the wars of aggression, the ideology of racial supremacy that had poisoned an entire nation. The concentration camps were real. The death marches were real. The mountains of shoes and eyeglasses and human hair at Auschwitz were real. But so were these children, eating ham with desperate hunger. So were these mothers weeping over chocolate. So were these grandmothers crossing themselves and praying in voices hoarse with gratitude. Private William Johnson from Alabama struggled with this more than most. His brother James had died in the Battle of the Bulge on December 18, 1944, exactly 1 year before Christmas, 1945. James had been 22, engaged to be married, planning to take over their father's farm after the war. A German artillery shell had blown him apart, leaving nothing identifiable to send home except his dog tags. William hated Germans with a purity that felt almost holy. He'd volunteered for occupation duty specifically because he wanted to be there when Germany suffered. Wanted to watch the arrogant bastards starve and freeze and learn what it meant to lose. He was billeted with the Hoffman family. Mother, grandmother, 2 daughters, and a 1-year-old baby girl named Elsa. Herr Hoffman had died in Russia in 1943. They were afraid of William, visibly afraid, and he was glad. Good, they should be afraid. But on Christmas Eve, the baby got sick. High fever, vomiting, listless, and unresponsive. Frau Hoffman was frantic, crying, begging William in broken English, "Please, please, doctor, we need doctor." There were no German doctors available. The medical system had collapsed, but the American military hospital was 3 blocks away, and William had access. He could have said no. He could have let the baby suffer. Payment for James for all the Americans who died at German hands. It would have been justified, fair even. Instead, he carried the baby to the American hospital, Frau Hoffman running beside him through the dark streets. He demanded treatment from the army doctors, who initially refused. Regulations prohibited treating German civilians except in extreme emergencies. "This is an extreme emergency," William said, his voice like iron. "Treat her. Now." They treated her. Pneumonia, caught early enough to cure with the new penicillin. Elsa Hoffman recovered. William Johnson sat with Frau Hoffman in the waiting room while the doctors worked, and she held his hand and wept, and he didn't pull away. He thought about James, about how James had always been the kind one, the one who'd nurse injured birds back to health on their farm, who'd cry at funerals. "James would have done this," William said quietly, more to himself than to Frau Hoffman. "My brother. He was good. He wouldn't have let her die." Later, he wrote to his parents, "I came here to hate, but I saw only people as broken by war as we are. I don't know what that means. I don't know how to carry this." The Christmas dinners of 1945 became acts of defiance against the clean geometries of war. War requires clear boundaries, us and them, victors and vanquished, good and evil. It requires that you see the enemy as other, as fundamentally different, as less than human. But it's hard to maintain that fiction when you're watching a 5-year-old boy taste chocolate for the first time, his eyes wide with wonder. It's hard to maintain that fiction when a mother thanks you with tears for saving her baby's life. It's hard to maintain that fiction when you realize that the woman serving you coffee lost her husband the same way you lost your brother. That grief is grief, regardless of which uniform the dead man wore. The commanders knew this was happening and didn't quite know what to do about it. Some bases organized official collections. Soldiers voluntarily donating parts of their rations to assemble Christmas packages for German families with children. It was against policy, but the alternative was enforcing regulations that would make the army look heartless, and there were limits to what even military discipline could demand. Other commanders looked the other way when soldiers accidentally left food behind in their billets, when they forgot candy bars on kitchen tables, when they happened to invite their German hosts to share meals. The non-fraternization policy officially remained in effect. Soldiers could still be punished for getting too friendly with Germans. But on Christmas night 1945, thousands of soldiers and German families sat together at tables, sharing what they had, and the brass decided not to see it. Thomas Mackenzie stayed at the Weber house until midnight. They sang songs together, carols that existed in both English and German. Strange hybrid performances where Thomas would sing a verse in English and the Webers would answer in German. Silent Night became Stille Nacht, became something that belonged to neither language and both. Before he left, Klaus gave him something, a drawing, done in colored pencils that Greta had hoarded from before the war. It showed a Christmas tree with a soldier standing next to it, both the soldier and the tree decorated with stars. At the bottom, in careful German script, Danke, Herr Thomas, von Klaus. Thomas folded it carefully and put it in his pocket, next to the photograph of his daughter. "I'll remember this," he said. "All of you. I'll remember. Will you come back?" Greta asked. "After you go home to America." Thomas looked at Anna, and something passed between them. Recognition, perhaps, of what this night had cost and given them both. "Yes," he said. "I'll come back." And he did. Twice. Once in 1950 when he brought his wife and daughter to meet the Webers, and once more in 1968 when he attended Klaus's wedding. The Webers kept his photograph on their mantelpiece for decades. A young American soldier in uniform, smiling awkwardly at the camera, his eyes kind. Klaus Weber, who'd received a toy truck on Christmas Eve, 1945, who'd tasted chocolate, for the first time, from an American soldier's gift, named his firstborn son Thomas. Thomas Weber grew up hearing the story of the Christmas when an enemy became a friend, when a knock on the door brought not fear but transformation. The Christmas of 1945 became a turning point in ways no one fully understood at the time. Germany was supposed to be punished, reformed, kept weak enough, never to threaten Europe again. The Morgenthau Plan, drafted in 1944, had proposed reducing Germany to an agricultural society, dismantling its industry, preventing it from ever again becoming a military power. But you can't break bread with someone and then destroy them. You can't watch their children eat with desperate hunger and then advocate for policies that would keep them hungry. You can't sit at their table on Christmas and then treat them as subhuman. The soldiers who came home from Germany carried stories that complicated the narrative. They told their families, their friends, their communities, yes, what Germany did was evil. Yes, the camps were real. Yes, justice is necessary. But also, the German people are suffering in ways that serve no purpose. The children are starving. The women are grieving. We can't just abandon them to misery. These stories mattered. They created political pressure that helped shift American policy from punishment to reconstruction, from the Morgenthau Plan to the Marshall Plan. By 1948, the United States was pouring billions of dollars into rebuilding Germany, understanding that a prosperous democratic Germany served everyone's interests better than a broken, resentful one. This wasn't sentiment overcoming sense. It was the recognition that the soldiers had learned at those Christmas tables, that dehumanizing the enemy might be necessary during war, but rehumanizing them is necessary for peace. 70 years later, historians would debate the meaning of Christmas 1945. Some saw it as the beginning of reconciliation, the first fragile shoots of a partnership that would eventually make Germany and the United States close allies. Others saw it as a dangerous sentimentality that overlooked the magnitude of German crimes, a premature forgiveness that Germany hadn't earned. Both interpretations miss something essential. What happened at those Christmas tables wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. Anna Weber never forgot that American bombs had destroyed her childhood home in Cologne, that the blockade had left her children hungry, that the occupation was an imposition even when it came with canned ham. Thomas Mackenzie never forgot what Germany had done, never stopped mourning his brother, never stopped being haunted by the photographs from Dachau that every soldier in his unit had been required to view. What happened was smaller and more profound than forgiveness. It was recognition. The recognition that the person across the table, despite everything, despite the uniforms and the flags and the history, was a person. That their grief was real grief. That their children's hunger was real hunger. That the categories of enemy and friend, victor and vanquished, were real and necessary, but also insufficient to capture the full complexity of human experience. This recognition didn't erase the past. It didn't make the war retroactively justified or unjustified. It didn't solve the impossible moral equations of guilt and punishment and justice. But it created a space Small, fragile, tentative, where a different future became imaginable. Where the defeated weren't permanently cast as monsters, where the victors weren't permanently cast as saviors, where people on both sides could begin the long, painful work of building something other than endless cycles of revenge. Anna Weber lived until 1986. In her final years, suffering from the dementia that erased most of her memories, she would sometimes wake up confused and ask Greta, "Is it Christmas yet? Is the American soldier coming?" "Yes, Mutti," Greta would tell her. "It's Christmas. He's coming." And Anna would smile, satisfied, and fall back asleep. The box Thomas Mackenzie brought on December 24th, 1945, was more than chocolate and ham and toys. It was an opening, a small crack in the wall between enemies, wide enough to glimpse the human on the other side, wide enough to imagine, despite everything, that the human on the other side might someday be something other than an enemy. In Europe's darkest winter, at thousands of tables across occupied Germany, the light of that recognition was kindled. It proved that even the cruelest war cannot entirely kill people's capacity for compassion, that the boundaries between us and them are real but also permeable, that transformation is possible even, especially, in the most unlikely circumstances. The door opened, the enemy entered, and everything changed. Not immediately, not completely, not without cost or complication, but irrevocably.